Just a couple of words about Westwood. We're a compassionate community of free religious thought, inviting all people to rest, grow, and serve the world. We welcome a diversity of viewpoints at Westwood, as you will discover as you get to know us. Sometimes we don't agree with each other, and we don't all think or love alike. That's diversity, and that's what we're aiming for. Making space for diversity requires that we all show respect and compassion in our interactions with each other, and we all do the best we can. We mess up, well, we call that compassionate imperfection. We forgive ourselves and we move on. And as we learn more, we're able to walk in the world more compassionately. Mitch Waldon, would you please come forward to do our land acknowledgement?
Thank you. I have a friend who happens to be First Nations, and I got talking about land acknowledgements, and he expressed how much he hates them. Because so often they're just a laundry list of names and all that kind of stuff, and I hate laundry lists of people because somebody always gets left out. And I was and he suggested you just speak from your heart, and so that's what I will do. And I have all kinds of thoughts in my head, and we'll see what comes out. I have memories of driving in a car when I was young, and we didn't have phones back then, those sorts of things, so we had to look out the windows. And in New Brunswick, we would go visit my grandparents drive from Dalhousie, New Brunswick, down to Fredericton, and we'd pass these areas, and the homes got a little shabby, and it's like, oh, what's going on here? I always wondered. And then we'd get out of this one area, and things would improve and all those sorts of things. And it was a long time before I found out that those, of course, were the reserve lands that we were driving through along the way. And it took me an awful long time to find out why those reserve lands were and still are the way they are. There were a lot of promises made, and promises absolutely broken, promises never made to be kept. There's a history of pushing people down, of refusing to let them live their lives. And that's something that I am ashamed to have been a part of, because I still am, really, because those things are going on, they're ongoing, and this series is a part of how we hope to make that better. And I think about our Métis folk who also had the same experiences. And it just struck me as I was thinking about this being Pride Month, that Métis people in particular were judged, and the racism that existed against them is based on who they loved. So here's to learning more and being able to walk forward and do something to change the world.
Beatrice Demetrius. Let's welcome our speaker with a hearty round of applause.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. So I'm Beatrice Demetrius. My father was a Joban. That's my family tree there. My grandfather and his brothers. My mother was a Johnston, and her family came from the Orkneys. So I'm Métis on both sides. I worked at the Métis Nation for many years as their genealogist. When the program first started, Métis had to get their citizenships done. They didn't have anyone to do the genealogy, and I had been doing it for quite a few years, just as a pastime, helping my friends and anybody that wanted help with a tree. So then I was hired. Oh, it was crazy, because there's one person, I'm the only person there for about 4 years before I got a helper. And the people were coming and coming and coming, and I finally started having classes, and I'd use the boardroom, and I could seat 25 people in there. And you can't go one-on-one to help these people. There's just too many, and you've only got the boardroom for 2 hours. So then I started something. I said, okay, these people here are looking for champagne. Anybody else in the room, champagne? Maybe a hand would go up. Then I'd introduce somebody else. And next thing you know, I had people working together. And of course, we had information. We have binders of different genealogies. Most of it all starting in Manitoba. However, they did start moving more west. For instance, 1795, they were already in Edmonton. La Clabiche. But then we were known as the Northwest Territories. So, getting back to I just want to say, my grandfather was with Louis Riel in 1885 in Batoche. He's the guy in the middle. And these are his 4 brothers. The one sitting, his name is Ambrose Jobin. He was shot the last day of the battle, and he died. The oldest brother up here was emissary to Louis Riel and actually wrote in his diaries. Of course, they lost the battle. So the whole family, after burying Ambrose, they escaped into North Dakota. All of a sudden, in 1893, my grandfather showed up in northern Alberta. And there was something in the newspaper about this man. Where did he come from, and who is he? They'd never heard that name before, Jobin. It was my grandpa. So he settled there, he got married, he became actually quite a well-to-do farmer in the Big Prairie area. And the Big Prairie area is about, 10 miles away from Peavine Métis settlement. He had 11 children, 4 boys, 7 girls. My dad was one of the older ones, Joseph. He was born in 1902, and they were all farmers. My grandfather died because he was born in 1860. Of course, I never got to know him because my parents had met or were married yet, which I'm really sad about. I wish I would have known him. I would have liked to ask a lot of questions. My dad died when I was 8 years old. So at that age, I don't know anything about history. I don't know what to ask, right? Who knows? When I got older, I heard a rumor that my grandfather was with Louis Riel, but it's a secret and you have to keep it quiet. And I thought, oh, wow. So I went to my mother and she said, don't talk about people that are deceased. They never talked about people that were deceased. So I would ask her questions, all kinds of things. She wouldn't tell me. I'd go to aunts and they didn't want to talk about any of that stuff. Then all of a sudden, out of the blue, maybe about a month or 2 later, she said, oh yeah, your grandfather died. He was in Batoche and they didn't want anyone to know. So finally it started coming out. So when I got that little bit of information, I went to the archives. Now the reason I went to the archives is sadly my grandfather was shot at the age of 73 by a hired man. And the story there is the hired man was trying to run off with his 16-year-old daughter, and my grandfather was going to stop him, and so he got shot. And I thought, okay, if I can find this information, and in the history book in my hometown, they talked all about the farmers. And when our part was in there, they said, oh, Mr. Jobin died in 1936, so I could find nothing at the archives. Then an old uncle I hadn't seen in years came up from Medicine Hat, and I started asking him questions. He was 95 years old, and he had a mind like a computer. He could remember dates. And I said, when did my grandfather die? He said, oh, I think it was about May 13th, 1934, or maybe it was the 15th, he said. Back I go to the archives, and there, it's all there. This big old scandal about this fellow that killed my grandfather. And then that's when that information was released, that he was a lieutenant for Louis Riel. So then our family was separated in 1885. The oldest brother, on the extreme left standing, Joseph, he took whichever family members survived to North Dakota, and that's where they were hiding, except for the young brother who was only 16. He was sickly. So what they did was they sent him to St. Albert with a priest, and the rest of them went to North Dakota. Well, in 1887, Joseph sent a letter to the commission in Saskatchewan. I have that letter. And they wrote back to him and they said, oh, you were a rebel with Louis Riel. And a couple of months later, he died. We don't know what from. So he's buried in St. John's, North Dakota. So then Ambrose is already killed. Patrice, the young brother, died in 1891. And Pierre on the extreme right died in 1890. They all died except my grandfather. There was 5 boys, 5 girls, and 1 sister. And the one sister that survived, Lucy, she was terrified. Like her sister married a Trottier. They moved into the States as well. For some reason, she died in 1899. Her husband died in 1894. And now there's 2 little orphan girls. And their surviving great aunt is Lucy, my grandfather's sister. So she became a matron in different, they called them then Indian residential schools, something like that. She became a matron, and she traveled from North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, Oklahoma, and finally ended up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where she passed away. She was terrified that somebody was always maybe chasing and looking for her, right? And she drugged these little girls along with her. So, like I say, the family separated in 1885. We didn't meet again till 2007. We finally all met back at Batoche. And we had family come from Ontario, from Quebec, from BC, all across the provinces. And that's the first gathering, because we never knew we had relatives. So now I'll go to my mother's side. Now, oh, my mom, she could embroider the most beautiful, beautiful things. And the best bread, she made the best bread, but she never made bannock. Her mother made it, and it was delicious. She would make these great big round bannocks and then put them in a larder, and we just loved it when we went there and we'd have bannock. There was only one thing we didn't like. She would make fish soup. So we'd be looking at the pot, and she'd have fish and potatoes and I don't know whatever else in there, and there's these bones sticking out, and we're thinking, oh my God, we're going to eat this and get bones stuck in our throat. She lived to 86. My grandfather married Olive Dumais. Her father worked for the Hudson's Bay Company as a postmaster up in the Caledonia area. That would be Hudson Hope, Dunveig, and all that area. He retired in 1888. He moved to St. Albert with his 3 daughters and 1 son. I don't know, the story I got was the son was working on top of a church. They were building a steeple or something, and he fell off and he died. So then his father, they were buried on the same day. I don't know if the father died from a heart attack or the shock of his only son, falling off the building. So now, here's these 3 girls, supposedly orphans, so the stories we heard. But that wasn't true. In later years, I found out the older girl got married. She moved to around the Lesser Slave Lake area. She came back to St. Albert and got my grandmother, took her to northern Alberta, and my grandfather met her, and they got married in 1895. Getting back to the Métis Nation, there was a lot of older people that complained about having to do their family tree to prove they're a Métis. And they're saying, well, I was a Métis all my life. Why do I have to prove to you who I am? Kind of thing. And I said, well, it's just a recommendation. And I actually had this Métis man from Laklabish. He was very fair. He had blue eyes. And he looked at me and he says, why is the Métis Nation hiring white people? I said, who's white? And he looked at me, and I'm the only one there. I said, hey, you're the one with blue eyes. And then he kind of just smiled. I did his tree for him, and then he was all happy. Oh, could you do my wife's too? It was hard to get them to go, the older people. The young ones were happy, but gradually they wanted more information because they never had this information, right? I have to tell you, the Métis are well recorded in history because of their religion. I can go to any church, any Catholic church, and I can find documents. Marriage, burials, births. It's amazing, all across the homeland. And the homeland's from northern Ontario all the way through till northern BC. That's what we call the homeland. Oh, and I'm sorry, North Dakota, Montana, and Minnesota. So today, any Métis that lives in any of those areas, including the United States, they can get a Métis card, although the Americans don't recognize Métis.
Sorry, question for Robert. You excluded Quebec.
Pardon me?
You excluded Quebec. Quebec did not have Métis. You said Ontario and so on, but not Quebec.
Well, Ontario, I'm talking about places like Moose Factory, Sault Ste. Marie, Thunder Bay, Kenora, those areas. Now, there's been a bit of a battle with a former national president. He says the rest of Ontario is not Métis. Well, that's not true. Where do you think they came from? They came from there to marry the women in Manitoba or whatever, the native women. So most recently, they did a huge research in Ontario. And the one place they totally denied was Mattawa. So I went checking to look for some genealogy. I found the family, and I found she got a Métis script. Well, what's she doing with a Métis script? See, that was one of the identifications. And so now we have a new national president. So hopefully things are going to calm down. You can't go tell people you're not Métis because you're from the wrong area. Because our Métis are everywhere. And plus they're all colors. So you don't know. They could be blonde. They could be dark. Exactly. And I now have about more than 400 photographs from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, which is like this, and it was just too heavy to bring because it had all this other stuff, but it shows what the Métis families looked like. So you'd see a whole family, and there would be the very blonde one there, and then medium, and then all of a sudden this really native little looking kid, eh? So everybody's all colors because of the white father and the native mother. I'm going to go back to the beginning with Cuthbert Grant. Who is our father? He was in the battle at Seven Oaks, and everybody knew there was a mixture going on. There's half white, they called us half caste, different kinds of names back in those days. He proclaimed, he said, we are a new nation of people. We are the bois brûlés, which means burnt wood, and we are not Indian and we are not white. And from that time on, because it was announced publicly, and they had that little battle in Seven Oaks, which we call Frog Plain, we totally identified this man as being our father. Another thing I found, I like collecting old newspaper clippings. This is one of them. This is the 200-year-old Métis custom that's been kept alive, And this was written in 1940 in the Lebret newspaper. So this is going back to the mid-1700s, where the Métis were already celebrating this occasion, which happens to be New Year's Eve. And it wasn't a party. Gathering of all the elders, and I think the youngest one in this on this list is about in their 80s. And so what they're doing is they're talking about Cuthbert Grant, men that died in Batoche. They're reminiscing. That's what they're doing. Then they have a 2-minute silence in honor of all these men. And then they have the Métis meal. And that the meal is in here if anyone wants to look at it. So after the battle, well, see what happened. Before the battle happened, actually, the Northwest Company, they were always getting the Métis on their side, saying, oh, don't go with the Hudson's Bay, because those two were fighting. And so they gave the Métis all these gifts, and one of the gifts was that Métis flag. So that flag was presented to them in 1814. They flew it in 1815, and then again at the Battle of Seven Oaks. They actually had it at the battle. Now, when you look at this flag, if you took these circles out, what do you have? You have the Scottish flag. So I think what those guys did was just make 2 circles. But we're proud of it. It's the oldest flag in Canada. I'm going to go a bit into Louis Riel. I spent a lifetime researching. There was almost 300 soldiers at that battle. I did their family trees, found their parents, their wives, their children, and I'm always looking for descendants. And one of the characters that I really, really stood out for me is Carrier. He was wounded the last day of the battle, but he wasn't dead. So what they did was they tied a rope around his neck and drug him till he died. And I had one of his descendants ask me what happened, how he died, but I couldn't tell him. I didn't want to tell him. He was just a young kid from BC. Well, about a year later, he called me. He says, I know how he died. Yeah. So there were some pretty brutal things that happened. There was 26 Métis killed in that battle. And I think there was about 1,000 soldiers from the east that were killed. They were strong men. I read the diary of one of the soldiers, and he was so scared. He says, we're approaching St. Laurent, and that's not far from Batoche. He said, we're going to meet the Métis giants. And they were big men. If you look, and I remember them telling me, and in pictures of my grandfather, their hands were huge, like they were big men, and I think it was a mixture of the native and the white. Because a lot of Europeans, I did some work on the Northwest Mounted Police, a lot of them were actually quite short, as well as the Scottish, I went to the Orkneys because I wanted to find Johnstons. So he came from a little town called Bersay. I was so shocked when I went in the library. There was a little section. I was looking for genealogy, of course. There was a little section there, and I looked. There was a pair of moccasins. There was a Métis sash. There was a fiddle. And so I went and asked the librarian. She didn't know much about it because she was a student and just kind of knew there. And I thought, it is true then. I finally found a couple of genealogists, and I got like a 400-page of the Johnston family that they gave me. So I thought, while I'm here, okay, I'm going to do more research. Because then I found a First Nations family that actually went to the Orkneys to meet their relatives. And they're from Whitefish Lake here in Alberta. And I did buy that little pamphlet, and somewhere at the Métis Nation, I misplaced it, I don't know exactly, because I donated all my books to them. So I decided to do some genealogy. We have 6 binders, like huge, of all the men that came from the Orkneys that married Métis or First Nations women. So anyone that has a Scottish background that is Métis, they will find that information at the Métis Nation. I did a lot of research in my time. I spent my lifetime researching. I went to the Latter-day Saints Church and did a lot of research there. Oh my God, it's amazing if you go there. I mean, I was there 5 days, and every day you're there for about 5-6 hours researching. And they have all these computers lined up. I don't know how many people sit in that room, but they have 5 floors. So my daughter-in-law, she's part Ukrainian, but then she thought she was Russian, then she thought she was Polish. She asked if I'd look for her stuff. So I went down to the 2nd floor, and that's European. You'll find every single European translator that can read and speak the language. I got back to the village of her great-great-great-great-grandfather and the mother, the great-great-grandmother. They were like 100 miles from each other in Ukraine. Now, the reason she thought she was Polish and then Russian is because Poland took over that area, then Russia took over it. So it's easy doing a tree to start with, because what happened is they migrated to Argentina in 1928, way before the wars. So I'm looking for them in Argentina, and all of a sudden they pop up. But then the great-great-grandfather has a Spanish name. I thought, well, why does he have a Spanish? You know, he's born in Ukraine. It's because there was no Greek, there was no Orthodox church in Argentina, so they all became Catholics. And if you're looking for anyone Catholic, you're going to find information. It was amazing how that all, I have it right to the point where they left that area, ended up in New York, which hotel they stayed at, the list of all the kids, and then into Edmonton. So if you want to find someone way back when, any nationality, you have to go there. Today I'm doing, well, before I get into that, so we sometimes run into a problem where people mix this up, like for instance, the city of Edmonton. We had there was a gathering of First Nations people and 1 Métis person. I think there was about 4 chiefs. They wanted to rename the park, Victoria Park. And of course they're arguing and fighting, is it going to be Métis, is it going to be First Nations, you know? And so the lady that was sitting on behalf of the Métis, she went to the president, she said, I can't compete with them, they don't even let me talk. Oh, don't worry. And she called me, she says, you have to go with Lorian to this meeting as a guest. But before I went, I did some research, and here I found out that land was Joseph McDonald, a Métis man owned that land. So I made pamphlets, handed them out to everybody. The next meeting, there was only 1 First Nations left. He was not giving up. So it ended up, and it wasn't him as much as it was his wife that kept arguing. Finally, in the end, 1 half was named for the First Nations, and the other half was named for Métis. Yeah, I don't hesitate to talk when it comes to my culture. Nobody's ever been prejudiced to me that I know of. I was raised in Big Prairie on a farm, and my friends were Caucasian, Métis, but never First Nations. They didn't like us. I don't know why. This one reserve, they just did not care for us at all. Maybe because they were isolated, you know? I don't know. In this farming community, my dad was a farmer. There was about 3 or 4 other Métis men that had farms there, and of course Caucasian. And they all, at harvest time, worked together from farm to farm to farm. Nobody was prejudiced to anybody. My dad's best friends were Caucasian guys. We went to a country school. I remember we would have to ride horses with our two older brothers, my sister and I. And of course, the boys complained about it. They don't want their little sisters riding with them on the horse. So then our dad bought us a horse. Oh, we loved this. We had to ride together. The first day after school, the boys always raced, and old Prince decided to run too, and we both fell off. Of course, the boys got in trouble, but yeah, so I went to a country school for 3 years, all grade 1 to grade 6, all in one room. It was the first 2 years we had two ladies that came to teach. I remember one of them was Miss Green, but I can't remember the first one. And then after that, they couldn't get anyone out there because it's out in the country. So then they got a grandpa from some farm down the road, Mr. Efferman. But he was 82 years old and he couldn't stand the noise of the kids, and everybody would get a strap, even if you didn't do anything. The first day, my brother and this little kid, and I know this is kind of embarrassing, I shouldn't say it, but this little kid, they called him Apple Jaws because they had really round little cheeks. They both at the same moment seen a candy on the floor and they blew. I mean, you don't get candy in those days on the farm. And they flew on the floor and they're fighting on the floor. I'm talking about 6-year-olds. So, of course, they're the first ones to get the strap. And then everybody's laughing, so then everybody else got the strap. Yeah, he lasted about a year, and that was it. Finally, they got a school bus, and we were bused into town. Now, I'm really scared now. We're going into town, my sister and I. In my family, we're all colors. We're kind of medium, light, and then dark. So I don't know how these town kids are. But it was all good. No, it was fine. We loved it. We ended up, after my dad died when I was 8 years old, we moved into town. I left the farm. My mother remarried, and we moved to BC. So I was in the city in the 60s, the early 60s. I came here. I met my best friend. We were both working at Alberta Government Telephones back then as long-distance operators, and we lost touch with each other. So one time, we have an assembly every year. People gather, it's for good times and also to share the business of what's going on with the nation. So this was in about 1985. And I seen her there, and she's a redhead. I said, "What are you doing here?" She said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "I'm a Métis." She said, "Well, so is my brother." I thought, oh, maybe she's adopted, you know. Because he was part of the organization, she thought they were Métis and she wasn't. I don't know. So we've been friends now for 50 years. We lost each other for a while, and then that's the lady I was going to bring tonight, but she's not feeling good, so yeah. I hope Oh, and what I wanted to say as well, when we were kids, we knew ourselves as being half-breeds. We didn't know the term Métis. It didn't bother us. That's what we were. And then all of a sudden, in the 60s, this term came out, oh, use Métis, don't use half-breed. That's not a good word. Well, never bothered me when I was a kid. But Louis Riel was the one that named the French mixture Métis. And in one of his reports, he said, "Go and ask the half-breeds to help us." And I thought, what is this? The half-breeds were the Scotch, Irish, the other mix, not the French ones. So I couldn't believe that they were called different than what the French mix was. There's some very sad tales about the battle. Charles Trottier was on the battlefield, and he kept calling out for his sons, and there was no answer. And he wrote in his report, he said, I thought everybody was dead. And then he said, all of a sudden I heard a young man singing in French the song of the Bois Brûlés. And that song is about the Battle of Seven Oaks and how they won that battle. He said, that gave me courage. And he was shouting out, courage, courage. And when I read that report, it almost brought tears to my eyes. It was so sad. I was able to get my hands on almost 50 pages of Louis Riel's counsel when they'd sit at the table during the battle, and they're talking about not strategizing to fight anybody. They're talking about Mrs. So-and-so doesn't have food, take her this or take her that, or so-and-so doesn't have a horse, get a horse for him. Like, they're talking about daily stuff. They're not talking about fighting anybody. I want to go back to Ambrose, the guy sitting down. He took a group of Métis and they went to Fish Creek, and he was shot in the leg at that time. So in one of the sessions, Riel is saying, take care of Ambrose. Because it didn't very clearly come out he was shot in the leg or in the hip, something like that. On the last day of the battle, he was shot in that same leg or hip, and so they amputated and he died. I'll tell you a little bit about the Battle of the Grand Couture. So the Métis like to hunt buffalo, everybody knows that. Normally they would go down to the States, into the Missouri River and along that way. So there was this big party of hunters, and they kind of split into three groups, going different ways. And this one group, the captain of that group was Jean-Baptiste Falcon, the son of our Métis poet. He sent three scouts to go out and, see what's out there, and they seen all these Sioux, a huge, huge, huge party of Sioux, and they raced back to tell, they're not looking friendly. So immediately what the Métis did is they circled their Red River carts, and they started to dig trenches to hide the women and the children. So then those three scouts went out again to see what they were up to, and they started to chase them. They caught the three of them, and they imprisoned them. Malatier was the one that got the worst of it. So now they're fighting. They're on their second day of fighting, and the person that's taking care of these prisoners is an American Frenchman. And he said, make a run for it. He said, I'll just say I wasn't looking and you guys leave. So away they went, but Malatier had a very slow horse and they caught him. So they killed him, of course, mutilated him and took him to show the Métis what they're going to do to them, if they don't give up. The battle went on for 3 days. When they'd get tired, Isabel Falcon would take her husband's gun and she would shoot too. Finally, on the third day, it started to rain and pour, and they're losing so many people. Like even Jean-Baptiste Falcon, he said, I hated to shoot the chief. He was such a handsome man on his horse. He said, but I had to, so he had to shoot him. And then there was many chiefs. There wasn't only one there. And finally, on the third day, one chief said, we're not going to defeat them. They have a Manitou with them. And that was Father LaFlèche, because they never went on a hunting trip without a priest. And they all survived except Malatier. And that was in 1851. If you go to Métis Fest, which is open to everybody, and it's free, it's on the 13th and 14th of this month. There's 8 storyboards about all the battles the Métis were in that you can read as you're going along. And then the monument, I think we have about 2,500 soldiers up, and we have another 4,000 to add. We're just waiting for funding. But it's such a beautiful place along the river, and they're having such a good time. There's no charge. We have white buffalo there. We have white elk, regular buffalo. There's free tours. And then, of course, they have all their entertainment, their Métis music, their jigging and fiddle playing, that sort of stuff. So just so you know, everybody's invited.
And that is where, Beatrice?
Métis Crossing. So it's about 12 miles. You go to Smoky Lake, and then there's directions. It's not that far away. They have a 40-room lodge there, brand new, just beautiful. The interpretive building is just gorgeous. Most recently, I don't know if they're called yurts. They're those round buildings, and they have a glass top. You can stay in there and look at the sky at night. They have 11 of those now. And apparently they're going to be building cabins. So you can rent these things, or you can take your camper, and there's a camping area. They have bathrooms and showers in the camping area. And they also rent out tents, hunter tents. And actually, it's not like the old tents in the old days. The beds are off the ground and, For the last meal of the day on Saturday, they roast 3 buffalo. Yeah, because sometimes we'll get up to 500 people. So if anybody is interested in going, the best day to go is Saturday, the 14th. So I continue to do research on Métis soldiers, World War I, World War II, and Korea. I'm at 7,000 soldiers now. And a couple of weeks ago, I went to Holland for their 80th year liberation party, and I found 40 Métis graves we were in Apeldoorn. And I know there's more, but I'm far from being finished my research. It's not so easy doing World War II because of the Privacy Act. But I have my ways of finding stuff. Anybody wants ask any questions, go ahead. I'll tell you one more story about Mrs. Berger. Now, this was in the Lewistown newspaper. So she was traveling with the buffalo hunters, and they were going from place to place. She said, sometimes we'd see a child just abandoned, a little maybe First Nations kid, and she said, we just pick them up and make them our own. Then they'd go, and they're traveling. If they seen buffaloes, she said she remembered the men. The night before the hunt, they would fall on their knees and say their prayers. They had rules for the hunt. You just didn't go out there and kill and do whatever. There were rules, and some of the rules are in one of the boards I have here. Yes. We have a problem sometimes in people, especially the city of Edmonton, because some of us sit on that board. I don't sit on the board, but I'm invited as a guest sometimes. And they can't understand that there is a difference between First Nations, Métis. They just don't get it. And you explain it to them. Actually, I was invited that one time, and I was trying to tell the director the difference, and she got quite upset with me, so I wasn't invited to come back again. And then she did some research, and she called me about 2 weeks later. She said, okay, I understand now there is a difference in Métis and First Nations. We're very proud of our culture, and we don't want to be mixed up with anybody else. So.
Beatrice, could you tell us about the project that you're doing in the Hardesty neighborhood here in Edmonton?
Oh, yes. So we were doing research on the Métis living along the river. Most of those men were Métis, or they married Métis women. I actually have a list, and I forgot to bring it, of all the people buried in Riverdale. And they're all Métis. There's about 3 First Nations. And then all of a sudden now, there's a whole bunch of First Nations. Nothing against them. I'm just saying that they were moving people, always moving. Where we settled, and we had graveyards, and we had burials because of our religion. And so what is down there now is not what it should be. So Hardesty. So Mr. Hardesty is Métis. They come from down east, and they had a daughter, Isabel. She married Mr. Lougheed, and their son was Peter Lougheed. So Peter Lougheed was a Métis person. I also want to talk about the Garneaus, because the Garneaus were also Métis, and actually all that land around the university, that was all given to the university by Mr. Garneau. And then somehow, I don't know if they wanted to get rid of him, he ended up in the St. Paul area, and he lost everything. As a matter of fact, about 3 years ago, they cut down the Garneau tree, and they had all the descendants of Garneau come, because that tree was, I can't remember how old the tree was, very old, and it was ready to, fall over. So I don't know if you guys heard about that. It was in the news. So a lot of those people, like Peter Lougheed never denied ever that he was not Métis. As a matter of fact, my brother worked for the government back in those years, and he knew Peter. And he told Fred, he said, I'm Métis too. So I remember we lived close to the Parliament grounds, and one of my little daughters, she was about 9, she decided to have a lemonade stand. And so there she set up outside with her little lemonade stand. Who should come along? Peter Lougheed's car, and his secretary gets out and buys 2 lemonades from her.
A few years ago, I was at a gathering where there were, booths, tables, so and so, and one of them was, I don't know if it was the Métis Nation, but it was some Métis organization, and I asked the question, how do you know if you're Métis? How does that work? And the answer I got was, well, you just can say you're a Métis person. That if you claim to be Métis, then we say, okay, you're Métis.
No,
but I hear you saying something very different.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Anybody that's a Métis Nation, we're sitting now at 73,000 members. Every single one of them has to have a family tree and prove they joined to a historical Métis person. And actually, we lost a lot of members when we first started because they did exactly that. They came in there and said, I'm Métis, and somebody gave them a card. The cards today are very much controlled. They're sent out, and nobody gets a card unless the president signs it, and the genealogist checks all the genealogy. Yeah. So that part's not true anymore.
How do you differentiate between someone who is Métis dating back to the time of Riel, whose family goes back that far?
Oh, it goes way back.
Yes, and someone who has parents, one who's white and one whose First Nations.
Okay, today, or say after the 1900, any white person that married a First Nations person, they're mixed blood, but they're not Métis. They're non-status Indians is what they call them. Yeah.
Yeah, because they'd lose their status. The women would lose their status
Yes.
if they married out of the
That's
tribe.
right.
Yeah.
And if someone from the reserve married a Caucasian, that Caucasian became an Indian and got a card, which was so ridiculous. Yeah.
I think they changed that.
Oh, yeah, they changed that. Hi.
I have a question. You had mentioned that initially, if you were French ancestry on one side, you were considered Métis, but there's others that were of other European ancestry, mixed blood. They were not considered to be Métis. Is that still the case, or what happened to that other group? They're not Métis?
Well, no, today he uses the term Métis. That's a new term that came out after Riel. Today, everybody uses Métis because they don't like to use the word half-breed. It bothers them. Doesn't bother me, that's how I was raised, but it bothers them, so everybody uses Métis today. But in fact, Riel and his men identified them as half-breeds.
So just a follow-up question then, to be a member of the Métis Nation, do you have to trace your ancestry to those Métis that were part of the French
Oh, no.
people? No, it
Oh,
could
no,
be
no, no.
any one of.
Oh, no, if they have a mixture of, my gosh, there's a whole lot of English, Irish, French, Norwegian, German, a lot of German too. As long as you can find that historical link, you can become a member, a citizen of the Métis Nation.
I think it has to do with like who was on the land script, right?
Pardon me?
It was like who was on the original like land script
I
list.
can't, you're muffled from your,
Sorry. I think it was like the original land script list. Like that's basically how like the Métis Nation of Alberta determines it, right?
well, not everybody got a Métis script. Doesn't mean you're not a Métis if you don't have a Métis script. But if you join to someone, you usually have to join to someone that has one or identified, self-identified, and lived within the homeland.
We're using the microphone so that the people who are on Zoom can hear what you say. Otherwise, what you say in the room doesn't get heard by them.
Could you clarify again the homeland? Like, when I'd asked earlier, Quebec was not part of the homeland?
No, they did not self-identify. What happened with Quebec, and I do know they mixed with First Nations, what happened with them is they would marry that Native woman, and as a matter of fact, I have distant relatives from Quebec, and they lived down in the States, and they sent me the family tree, and they said, so you're the Native part of our family. We don't have Natives in our... And I'm looking at the paper, and I thought, gee, that great-grandmother sure looks Native to me. What would happen is if they married the French in Quebec, then they're French. If the man did not marry them, they went back with their kids to the tribe and just remained First Nations. They fought no battles to say they were Métis. They didn't protest at any time historically that they were Métis. We started all the trouble in Manitoba. However, this last battle, if we didn't have this last battle in Batoche, John A. Macdonald said, in 100 years, there'll be no more Métis. Well, we're still here. And that battle saved us, really. And that's what it was. It was all about rights. It wasn't because we wanted to fight. We didn't want to fight. And I do know after that battle, a lot of the Métis, especially the ones that, could pass for white, they would never say they were Métis or half-breed. They would live in the white community. I had cousins that lived in the white community in a town 30 miles away. First cousins. But they were darker than me. They said they were French, pure French. I guess there was some shame in that town because they're a French town.
Can I verify that? So if a native woman marries a white, she loses her status?
Not today. Not
Well,
today.
she did.
Then, yeah, before 1980. Yeah.
She would lose her status, a native woman marrying a white. But a white woman marrying a native would keep,
She'd become a treaty.
she'd become a treaty.
Yes. And I personally know a couple.
Complicated.
I personally know a couple that were married prior to the 1980s, and she's a white woman, and she has a treaty card. Now, I don't know if they took them away. Do you think they did? I haven't heard any more about that.
I believe that they have reinstated the status of women
Oh, yeah,
who
they
married.
did, but what about the white woman that has a treaty card?
That
See,
part I don't know.
Now, as late as 1986, I'm always living in the 1800s. In 1986, I was going to Grant McEwen, and there was a First Nations, well, she wasn't First Nations, she was Caucasian, but she married the chief's son prior to 1980s, and so she had a status card. And of course, she's getting all her education and everything paid for, eh? But she was a white woman.
I just want to mention that, as Beatrice mentioned, a lot of Métis people grew up in white communities, and I thought I was white until I was 45, and I didn't get my Métis card until a couple of months ago. But my family has been Red River Métis for 8 generations. But because of the racism my father experienced, he completely rejected the fact that he had any Indigenous ancestry whatsoever. In fact, I remember during Truth and Reconciliation, they had a board up where people could put their memories on the board. And I said that I remembered my father putting white makeup on his face every time he had to go out, so that he would look white and not look indigenous at all. And that's how I was brought up. And I didn't realize that I was Métis, many generations of Métis, until I was an adult. And that's very common, actually, for Métis people.
For some
in this
people,
province.
yes.
Yeah,
My family were rebels, they just fought.
yeah.
There's someone over there.
And I understand that Edmonton's first map is a river lot map because of the settlement coming out of Fort Edmonton. When Fort Edmonton was kind of closing down, then the Métis employees of the forts took farms around the fort. And so that is the birth of our city, is Métis roots.
Yes. Well, they came here as early as the 1795s. Now, right now, we have a problem with our hunters. They had to be born, or some ancestor had to be born in Alberta in order for them to get hunting rights. And they don't even have full hunting rights. Harvesting rights, I guess is what you call it. So doing the research for them is a totally different department. And it's more difficult. In some cases, they came from Manitoba with the Hudson's Bay, they worked here, and one kid was born here. So that kid could be a hunter. But then they went back, and the other kid was born in Manitoba, could not get their hunting rights. Because the father was not from here, the mother was not from here, but because the child was born here, and there was a link, he could get his Métis card. I've had a lady from Ontario, Senator Rita Gordon, and they were trying to do their genealogy. This was back in 2003, and everybody's in a panic to get theirs. She said, I can't find nothing. So she gave me some names, but she didn't have much. And the part of Ontario she's living in, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know if this lady's going to have any luck. I said, give me what you have. And, you know, when I have time, I'll look for it. But I'm so busy with us because we're all new too. So I pinned this up on my desk. I had a little shelf here. I pinned her little information there. And a couple of months later, boom, I ran into a great uncle of hers that went to Manitoba and actually self-identified as a Métis and actually got a Métis script. She was so thrilled.
I just wanted to just add on to your story about growing up white. We always knew in our family, my grandmother was half Native. But our family indeed did grow up white and was sheltered from it. And in fact, my father hid from it and ignored it and would not recognize that he was actually Métis. So my daughter thankfully helped me get on the road and we got our cards just last year. So very excited and now learning about our heritage, which is something that I really missed out on.
A lot of our people are ashamed of that Native blood. I was at another meeting here not long ago, and they were talking about how some of the natives are treated in the hospitals and the healthcare areas. And I remember hearing the postmaster say once, I was in the post office, and a native had just walked out. I don't know if he was Métis or if he was First Nations, but the man working behind the counter said to the woman next to him, he says, the Indians never look you in the eye. They always have their head down. So at this meeting I went to, I said, remember, when you're talking to anybody, you look at them in the eye. Don't let them intimidate you. If you're going to be putting your head down, they've got the power over you. Because some of them were talking about people being prejudiced to them in the healthcare area.
A question about the Second World War generation, the soldiers who went to Europe. I knew a fellow named Mr. Fiddler, and he was in France and Belgium and Holland. He came back. But my question is about, I know the Canadian soldiers, the white soldiers, would come back from the war and they would be given plots of land and things to help them out. But was it common for Métis veterans to be given anything in return?
Okay. With all the soldiers that I have done, which is 7,000 now, if you were pale, and they didn't ask you if you were white, they just wrote down that you were white. So those guys came back, they got land. But if they would have asked them, I don't know if they would have said they were Métis or half-breed, but there was many that I found that actually did get land.
And then there would have been a whole bunch who didn't.
Yeah, and actually identifying the soldier, especially in World War I, they just say, oh, he's an Indian. Even if he wasn't, if he was a mixed blood, they just called him an Indian. I think I seen 2 charts only out of almost 3,000 men.
Would you just say a word or two about Métis script?
Sure. That was a big farce. Yeah. So there was a Métis script given in Manitoba in 1870 after the resistance with Louis Riel, 69-70, and he had to escape to go hide in the States. Then, of course, the Métis that stayed behind were, they're worried about them because, they're going to cause problems again. So then they decide they're going to give them Métis script. But it was just land, not money. And my grandfather, the one in the middle, he had his Métis script in Carmen, Manitoba. And then his brothers were around the area as well. Anyway, they had gone away, I don't know where, but they were away for about a month, and they came back, and there was white settlers living on their land. This was in 1883, so you can imagine that's why they joined Riel in 1884. But Métis script is, The only one I know of it that still had it is actually Métis Crossing, the Cromarties. They owned that land, and it was Métis script. And the family died years and years and years ago. There was a whole, in 1854, I think it was, there was many Manitobas that went to the Smoky Lake, Victoria settlement area, and these guys bought this land, which is Métis Crossing today, and descendants, about 20 years ago, they approached the Métis Nation and told Audrey if she was interested in buying the place, it was Métis, a Métis script land, that she could buy it. Well, we didn't have no money. But we have Mr. Brossu and Mr. Belcourt, who actually supply. They have scholarships that they give to our kids. They gave our Métis Nation $1 million so we could buy it.
A couple of years ago, I think it was, I saw billboards talking about a Métis Constitution. Wonder if you could talk about that.
Okay, that's still ongoing. It went to 3 readings. It's at the Senate, I think, now, and now we're just waiting. We've been waiting since 1860 to get our rights back, and we're on the tip of it. But a lot of times, our own people didn't want it. Oh, no, it's too early. No, you can't do that. But we've been talking about this for years and years and years. I remember back in 1971, I went to my first assembly, which is a gathering of the Métis, and they talked even then. They wanted their own government. So we had a vote at an assembly. There were 600 people there. And the complainers, I don't know why they complained, because they were even new people, like they didn't seem to know a whole lot about it. And one of them was a lawyer, actually. So we had a vote. 592 said yes, 8 said no. So we went ahead and applied. So now we're just waiting. And I don't want to, I'm not really into politics, but we think the Liberal government will give it to us. I'm not saying who I support, I'm just saying. No, it's because Trudeau was the one that let us get that far, even though I'm not saying I'm a fan.
Is there anyone else with a question? Okay, we're going to take one last question from Elaine here, and noting the time on the clock, it will be our last question.
Never mind.
No? Oh.
Is there anyone on Zoom that has questions?
I'm sorry, I didn't ask Zoom people if they had questions. Not so far. Okay. Since Elaine gave away her question, Carl gets to ask.
No, it's not a question, it's a comment that for people to be aware that tonight's session is being recorded. And I assume you're agreeable that it can be available. Yes. And that this, you were going to say that.
Anyway, oh, of course.
This is a very historically important.
We like people to know who we are.
This is really important information that in the future will be very valuable, as well as in the present.
Well, I hope I brought enough information to you people today. There's much, much more, but that could go on and forever.
You see the displays up here that Beatrice brought. You're invited to take a closer peek at them. And for those of you who are on Zoom, Lorian has taken photos of everything, and those will be added to the Zoom recording. So that means the Zoom people will get to see them better, and that also means we can go look at the recording later and take a look again if we want to. That's right, and if you go to the Westwood website, you'll find a link to the recording. Okay? Oh, and in a few days, yes. And the Westwood website is westwoodunitarian.ca. Somebody said I had to say that, so now I've said it. Let's see what else we have here. Oh, we have to say thank you for supper. I don't know, is Crystal downstairs by any chance? Okay. Okay. We might as well haul her up here and clap for her. She has made us soup and bannock every time for a couple of 3 years now. So it's always good, is right. If there's anyone who would like to help with putting away chairs and tables when we've finished, your help is very gladly accepted. And I know that all of you just want to clap for...
I want you to have, this is a lot of history in there.
For Beatrice.
And there's stories about Métis women.
Thank you very much.
This is Crystal, everyone. Thank you so much for feeding us, Crystal, again. Oh, yes, and we have contact information for Crystal. She caters, so if you're interested, we can put you in touch with her, and you too can have the soup we've been having. And, okay, a big round of applause for Beatrice. Thank you so much. It's been so informative and spoken in such an accessible sort of way. I really appreciate it. We all
Well,
do.
I could have talked for another 2 hours, but